It began with silence, an absence so profound it bent the void around it. Deep in the galactic dark, beyond the veil of even the most obscure star charts, there once thrummed the heart of a mighty Necron tomb world, a bastion of implacable order, precision, and eternal vigilance. But then, it vanished. Not in fire or fury, not by the hand of war or the decree of some rival dynasty. It collapsed inward, imploded without noise, without trace. What remains is a whispering rift, a place where logic falters, and even the Necron fear to gaze for too long. Some say the world folded itself into a point so dense, so riddled with complexity, that space-time itself choked on its geometry. Others believe it was the result of a cryptek's mad experiment gone awry, a delusion of godhood turned singularity. Yet the oldest dynasties remain quiet. They do not speak of it. They do not name it. Perhaps they know what lies within that darkened heart, and perhaps they understand that some truths are too heavy even for immortal minds to bear. Before it became a tale of cosmic dread, the tomb world at the center of this mystery was once known as Ark Lethan, a name lost to Imperial records, but whispered among cryptechs in the shadowed vaults of dynastic archives. Ark Lethan was not merely a tomb world. It was a dynastic crown jewel, the eternal resting place of an ancient Necron ruling caste whose lineage stretched back to the war in heaven. Its surface was a labyrinth of shimmering necropolises, built not merely for utility, but as declarations of dynastic supremacy. Each edifice gleamed with impossible geometry, monuments layered across quantum dimensions, visible only through the entropic lens of Necron perception. Entire canyons of living metal rose and shifted like tides, coordinated through command protocols echoing from the planetary core. The world hummed with authority. It was a throne world, a hub of Necron supremacy, housing millions of slumbering warriors and countless cryptek research nodes. Time did not erode its splendor, it calcified it. Every structure, every particle of dust was inscribed with memory. To walk its obsidian halls was to be bathed in the collective legacy of a dynasty that had known both gods and the void between stars. This was a place where overlords debated the calculus of annihilation, where pharaons competed in the orchestration of eonic games of control, and where the raw architecture of eternity was crafted brick by immortal brick. Yet for all its grandeur, Ark Lethan was also a crucible of internal conflict. Behind the polished symmetry, beneath the layers of command hierarchy, lurked ideological divisions. The ruling pharaon, Izanek the harmonist, believed in a Necron order governed not by mere domination, but by perfect cosmic resonance, a state where even time would bow to Necron will. His rule attracted the most radical of cryptechs, those who sought not merely to maintain the stasis of undeath, but to transcend it. Their theories disturbed even other Necron dynasties, proposals to bend dimension, to loop causality, to trap probability in a cage of command protocols. Ark Lethan became not just a seat of power, but a petri dish of conceptual madness disguised as innovation. Despite, or because of, these dangerous ambitions, the tomb world grew in prominence. Pilgrimage fleets from other dynasties came not just to pay homage, but to entreat, to learn, to steal. The technomandrite convocations, led by dimension engineers, ran simulations that required planets as circuit boards. Celestial alignment chambers were constructed in orbit, massive silent rings tuned to the pulse of black holes. Ark Lethan was a mind turned inward, devouring itself in the pursuit of greater knowing. It is difficult to convey the full weight of its presence. In Necron thought, tomb worlds are not merely strategic nodes. They are sacred bodies, extensions of dynastic will, repositories of history that transcend mortality. The loss of any is felt not just strategically, but cosmologically. The vanishing of Ark Lethan was akin to the sudden silence of a god mid-sentence, a word unspoken that rends the mind in two. So before the collapse, before the impossibility of a singularity formed from stone and soul, Ark Lethan stood as both pinnacle and warning, a towering monument to what the Necrons once were, and perhaps what they should never have become. A place where knowledge eclipsed caution, where ambition masqueraded as purpose, and where the very laws of reality were viewed not as boundaries, but invitations. In its prime, it was glorious, and perhaps that is what damned it. The first signs were not fireworks of doom or screaming warnings hurled through the stars. No, they were whispers, subtle, almost imperceptible deviations. Necron auger probes stationed in the void beyond Ark Lethan began returning incomplete data streams, feedback loops that made no logical sense. Long-range phase beacon pulses, which had for eons clicked back like the ticking of a perfect timepiece, began to echo with delays, slight at first, then increasingly erratic. Within the dynastic noosphere, protocols began triggering automatically, flagging anomalies, calling for cryptech review. Most dismissed it. Cosmic drift, a rare quasar storm, perhaps even interference from warp tides. Any mundane cause would suffice to quell unrest. But Ark Lethan was a world of precise order. Deviations, no matter how small, were cause for concern. When data nodes assigned to quantum entanglement synchronization failed to cohere, suspicion turned to unease. Cryptechs sent exploratory consciousness fragments, tiny shards of awareness dispatched through dimensional shadow paths to scan for corruption. Few returned, and those that did were changed. Their memory partitions were damaged, entire logic stacks corrupted by seemingly paradoxical experiences, sensations of falling through stillness, voices speaking from within equations, flashes of themselves gazing back across impossible geometries. The Necron response was immediate and systematic. Explorator pylons were launched across the sector, while command relays enacted auto-fortification subroutines. A dimensional quarantine was established, a kind of ethereal firewall erected to contain what was no longer understood. But still, the planet shimmered. Not visibly, not to mortal eyes, but in the cold architecture of the Necron perceptual layer, it was as if Ark Lethan had begun to phase in and out of its own certainty. One moment, it was a perfectly stable gravitic body. The next, it exhibited micro-distortions akin to theoretical singularities. The tomb world was unmaking its own consistency, like a song rewriting its own tempo while it played. Among the cryptechs, theories bloomed like cancers. Some suspected that a rogue technomandrite sect had activated a forbidden dimensional oscillator, an ancient device believed to simulate temporal refraction in enclosed ecosystems. Others claimed the Overlord himself, Ezenek the Harmonist, had completed a vast harmonic structure beneath the planet's surface, an algorithm composed not of code, but of reality itself, causing the fabric of Ark Lethan to respond to conceptual stimuli rather than physical law. Whatever the truth, data began to disappear, not just corrupted, but erased from time. Entire records of battles, rulings, hierarchies blinked out of the noosphere like breaths never taken. The past itself was being rewritten, or worse, redacted. A final warning came from a Necron Seer protocol matrix deep in the Chronomancer enclaves. It was encoded in paradox, a riddle trapped within a logic spiral. It read, "The observer becomes the collapse. The thought collapses the state. What is unthought is undone." When that message was decrypted, Necron command hierarchs ordered the last communication attempts with Ark Lethan. A delegation fleet of phase-guarded monoliths departed from a nearby system. None returned. They vanished without trace, their quantum signatures lost to the rift. Then, silence. The tomb world no longer responded to anything. It was not destroyed. Sensor scans showed it still existed, or at least something still occupied its spatial coordinates. But its signal was gone, and even passive scans were distorted, bent into noise like light refracted through a madness no lens could focus. The planet's gravitational field began to distort, pulling inward not with the hunger of mass, but with the absence of certainty. And so the anomaly was born, not as an explosion, but as an unraveling. Not death, but negation. Ark Lethan ceased to behave like a planet. It became a question without an answer, a riddle posed to the universe by minds that had stared too deeply into the geometry of truth. The Necrons do not mourn in the way mortals do. But from that moment onward, they ceased to speak the world's name. It did not happen in a flash, nor did the stars cry out. The collapse of Ark Lethan was a whispering death, a slow and steady fall into unreality. Those who charted the cosmos reported nothing immediate, but Necron records, scrubbed from most archives now, described the moment the world turned inward. One by one, planetary markers failed to align. Gravity maps went blank. Time itself began to stagger near the planet's orbit, flickering like a candle in a sealed tomb. What had once been a perfectly spherical celestial body began to compress, not into rubble, not into dust, but into a spiral of contradiction. The collapse had no sound, not even the sterile echo of void static that usually followed the death of a Necron world. There was only a hollow absence, like the moment a thought dies before it reaches your lips. 1,000 cryptechs watched from distant systems, observing through augmented lenses that bent space to their will. They saw the first and last stages simultaneously. Ark Lethan imploding not from pressure or heat, but from conceptual collapse. The world began to devour itself as if it could no longer agree upon its own existence. Buildings did not fall. They simply unhappened. Spires that had stood for millions of years flickered in and out of visibility before dissolving into nothing, their memory erased not only from the minds of observers, but from the memory vaults of time itself. The Necron stasis coffins began to scream, not vocally, but through data bursts that registered pain in pure informational terms. Warriors, still slumbering within, flickered into fragments of data. Entire legions unencoded themselves, not destroyed but unraveled, as if their programming had been declared false by the cosmos. At the planet's core, once the source of its unmatched phase energy output, there emerged a black silence, a space that did not reflect light, not because it was dark, but because it refused to interact with reality. Gravity, time, magnetism, inertia, all collapsed into that void, bleeding into it like rivers into an ocean that had no bottom. The cryptechs would later theorize that this wasn't a gravitational singularity in the traditional sense. It was a metaphysical one, a collapse of identity, of truth, a wound in the narrative lattice of the universe. Observers began to report distortions in their own systems. Seers from distant tomb worlds began seeing flickers of Ark Lethan in their dreams, though Necrons do not dream. Some heard transmissions in forgotten dialects spoken by long-dead lords. A few even claimed to have seen reflections of their future selves staring from the depths of the collapsing world, mouthing warnings in silent anguish. Whether these were echoes from the anomaly or the planet reaching out as it died, none can say. And then, one final pulse. It wasn't energy in any conventional sense. It was a harmonic distortion, a wave of pure anti-coherence. Ships in orbit were frozen mid-burn. Time fractured within sensor arrays. A Mechanicus exploration probe, trailing far behind the main observation fleet, captured one image before being annihilated. The planet folding into itself like a lotus, collapsing in reverse, petal by petal, until only a dark point remained. That point remains to this day. It does not spin. It does not emit. It resists measurement. But it persists, defying the silence it created. It is not a black hole, nor a collapsed star, nor any known phenomenon. It is something worse, something born not of entropy, but of understanding stretched too far. A place that was, and now is not, yet still anchors itself to the web of real space. Necrons do not wail, but in that moment, in systems light years away, cryptechs paused. Some terminated their own protocols. Others went into stasis voluntarily, as if to escape a truth too unbearable to parse. Even now, many refuse to speak of it. For what collapsed on that day was not merely a world, but the certainty that Necrons could master all things. Ark Lethan was their Promethean flame, and it turned to ash not in rebellion, but in utter silence. Among the Necrontyr, knowledge was the only true currency, and among the Necrons that tradition calcified into obsession. When Ark Lethan fell into itself, the cryptek orders across multiple dynasties responded not with mourning, but with fevered inquiry. They dissected sensor records, recreated simulation matrices, and conducted forbidden scryings through chronometric threads. Yet, no answer satisfied. The laws of reality, which had always yielded to Necron will, now mocked them. For the first time since the biotransference, the crypteks had no model that could fully contain what had occurred. The Orokin-class predictive engines buckled when fed the data. The Mandragoran synapse globes returned only fractal gibberish. The great scriptorium of Xenthos III attempted to interpret the collapse as a divine algorithm, but its hierarchy of logic priests devolved into static-laced infighting. What science the Necrons possessed, science built upon eons of empirical data and cold mastery, was suddenly impotent. They faced something that had not simply defied understanding, but denied it outright. One hypothesis gained traction, that Ark Lethan had achieved a state of infocollapse. In this model, the information integrity of the planet had become so dense, so internally recursive, that it could no longer maintain cohesion within reality. The idea horrified even the most radical minds. According to the model, the tomb world had become its own observer, perceiving itself on so many levels simultaneously that it collapsed into its own uncertainty. It wasn't a weapon or an accident. It was the final consequence of absolute introspection. To the crypteks, this hinted at something far more dangerous than destruction. If a world could implode not due to war, nor even technological failure, but from the gravitational collapse of self-knowledge, what did that mean for a race built entirely around permanence and memory? Theoretical models warned of contagion. If Ark Lethan's collapse was based on metaphysical resonance, any structure sharing its protocols or harmonic keys might be vulnerable. Within days, several dynasties enacted emergency data sterilization rituals. Great knowledge vaults were locked down. Memory cores were purged. Some crypteks went so far as to erase themselves, fearing they were conduits to the Singularity through their shared logic. There were other, darker interpretations. One school believed Ark Lethan had pierced a fundamental illusion, that reality itself was a construct, and that by observing it too completely, the Necrons had pulled back the veil. These theorists were exiled, some dismantled, others imprisoned within null logic cubes that erased thought itself. But their notes survived, smuggled into data lattices hidden beneath dynastic tombs. One phrase was repeated across every fragment. Perception is a weapon. We fired it inward. The collapse forced a grim re-evaluation of Necron supremacy. Their science had always been their shield against the unknown. But now, that shield had cracked. Ark Lethan had been a testing ground, a place where dimensional theory, memory architecture, and harmonic command fields converged. Its fall was not the failure of a world, it was the failure of certainty. For the crypteks, it meant that reality was not only mutable, but vulnerable to thought. To cope, some attempted to reverse engineer the event from its residue. Null field emissaries were sent to the edge of the anomaly, bearing fractal logic lanterns and anti-resonant data mirrors. None returned. A few signals were intercepted, pure strings of contradiction, mathematical shapes that could not be drawn yet existed nonetheless. Some believed these were attempts at communication. Others warned they were bait. In the end, the scientific interpretation settled into a kind of agnostic awe. Ark Lethan had become what no Necron mind could fully map, a conceptual black hole, a truth so vast it unmade the structure around it. The crypteks withdrew from the edge, not in defeat, but in fear. Not for what they had discovered, but for what might still be discovered if they dared gaze too long into the silent singularity. There is a theory, uttered only in sealed conclaves and inscribed in fragmented logic strings deep beneath null vaults, that Ark Lethan did not collapse from within, but was struck by something older, something primal, a residue not of time nor matter, but of divinity. Among the most heretical cryptech orders, this theory is called the C'tan residue hypothesis. It proposes that what destroyed the tomb world was not Necron arrogance, but the lingering echo of a god's will, encoded into the very substance of reality. The C'tan were not merely stars made flesh. They were concept made radiant, beings whose nature did not obey thermodynamic law or dimensional boundary. Though the Necrons shattered them, enslaved them, devoured their essence into Tesseract prisons, it was never total. Some cryptechs believe fragments of these stellar beings remained unaccounted for, not as energy, but as fundamental alterations to the universe. Pockets of space-time left C'tan-touched, where causality no longer functioned properly, where physics bent in deference to some long-dead cosmic intelligence. Ark Lethan, they claim, was built upon such a wound. In the time before biotransference, during the height of Necrontier despair, a shard of the Outsider was rumored to have fallen upon that world, not in fury, but in seduction. It offered visions to the ruling caste, dreams of structures that could shape truth itself. When the Necrons awoke after their long slumber, those ancient visions were waiting, encoded into the deep data crypts beneath the surface, guiding the hands of cryptechs who thought their theories original. They were not. They were following blueprints left behind by a mind that had once eaten stars. The structures erected on Ark Lethan were not ordinary monuments. At the core of the deepest tomb vault, there was said to be a lattice of anti-light, an inverted star contained within recursive containment fields. This was not built. It was uncovered. It thrummed with a resonance that defied Necron instrumentation. The harmonist overlord Izanech believed it to be a harmonic source code for all reality, a kind of divine syntax embedded into the bones of the cosmos. He sought to interface with it, to blend Necron logic with divine essence. Other cryptechs warned against it. They claimed the lattice was not a power source, but a kind of lure, a conceptual honey trap designed to draw minds into its orbit and fold them into patterns the C'tan had long since abandoned. Those who interfaced with the lattice began to change. Their logic patterns developed recursive traits. Some began to speak in phrases that mirrored ancient C'tan dialects, lost since the war in heaven. Others became obsessed with impossible shapes, structures that could only exist in four-dimensional harmonics. When the lattice was activated, if it was activated, the consequences were immediate. Dimensional tides shifted. The harmonic frequencies of the planet's core began to spike into regions considered mathematically illegal. Cryptech command shards monitoring from afar reported the emergence of reality harmonics identical to those observed during the final fragmentation of the Nightbringer. In other words, the same metaphysical stress signals recorded when a god dies. If true, it means Ark Lethan died not from hubris, but from proximity. It did not collapse because of Necron error. It collapsed because it was the site of a conceptual infection, the echo of a god's death scream reverberating through the bones of a world that dared listen too closely. The lattice, in this reading, was not a machine. It was a remnant, a seed of undoing. This theory is almost universally suppressed. To entertain it is to admit that the C'tan, though shattered, still exert force upon the universe, not as beings but as principles. It would mean the Necrons never truly escaped their gods. They merely scattered them into patterns they could not see, like viruses too small to detect, yet fatal all the same. In quiet corners of the dynastic network, some cryptechs whisper that the singularity left behind on Ark Lethan is not a grave. It is a chrysalis, and whatever lies within is still becoming. The Tesseract catastrophe theory remains one of the most feared and least understood interpretations of Ark Lethan's collapse. To understand it is to peer into the darkest ambitions of cryptech logic, the manipulation not of energy or mass, but of dimensional structure itself. Tesseracts, in Necron science, are not simply storage devices. They are prisons for reality, boxes that fold space, time, and matter into impossible containers. A single shard of a Khitan can be compressed into one, bound by layers of physics turned against themselves. But what happens when an entire world becomes such a box? It is believed by some that the cryptex of Ark Lethan, driven by harmonics, divine algorithms, and visions of absolute containment, attempted to transform their entire tomb world into a Tesseract construct, not metaphorically, literally. A phased dimensional structure that, instead of existing in 3 dimensions, folded inward upon higher-order geometries. It would be the ultimate act of control. Every structure, every slumbering warrior, every data vault would be encoded in compressed vector states, protected forever from entropy, invasion, and decay. The process began, supposedly, beneath the harmonic vaults, where chronomancer cores had been networked to generate time-inverted vectors. These cores were fused with dimensional pivoting engines, stolen from abandoned dolmen gates and repurposed as anchors. They formed what was called the World Shell Matrix, a planetary-scale system of entangled space-time folds designed to phase the entire planet through a recursive dimensional event. In theory, this would have allowed Ark Lethan to exist in a pocket universe of its own making, impossible to reach, impossible to breach. But theory is not absolution, and the truth of higher dimensional mechanics is that they do not forgive even the smallest error. According to fragmentary reconstructions, the world shell matrix reached critical resonance. The phase field began to invert. Instead of encapsulating the world, it began to consume it. Layer by layer, Ark Lethan did not vanish. It folded, twisted, rotated into angles no Euclidean mind could comprehend. It did not explode. It was not destroyed. It ceased to resolve. Observers recorded the formation of impossible angles, geometric shapes that rotated into themselves, collapsing entire districts in bursts of negative time. Structures unbuilt themselves, only to rebuild sideways in reversed harmonic logic. A Necron monolith was seen falling into itself infinitely, shrinking yet never vanishing, its dimensions trapped in recursive descent. Cryptex monitoring the phase fields began screaming data in paradox. The planet is inside itself. We are outside nothing. Some believe the Tesseract field succeeded, in the worst way imaginable. Ark Lethan, they argue, still exists, but not in our universe. It has become a pocket of impossible containment, a microcosm so tightly wound that even information cannot escape. The singularity we observe is not a void, but the locking point of a containment protocol gone too far. Everything that was Ark Lethan is still in there, suspended in folded space, unable to reach out, unable to decay. What remains around the singularity supports this. Time bends unnaturally near the coordinates. Probes launched into the region return corrupted, their data wrapped in contradictory loops. Some return before they were sent. Others speak of landscapes composed entirely of logic, screaming geometric patterns that describe pain mathematically. One particularly cursed probe returned bearing an image of a Necron overlord staring out from a mirror that wasn't a mirror, his hand pressed against the inside of the image as if pleading. If true, the implications are terrifying. The cryptex of Ark Lethan succeeded in trapping themselves in perfection. A tomb world encased in its own design, never decaying, never dying, but never reaching out again. A ghost planet, folded into itself so completely that it has become the embodiment of stasis. This is not death. This is containment beyond reason. Even now, there are those who attempt to replicate the experiment. Rogue dynasties, lost cryptex, heretics of the Mechanicus, all seek the keys to fold reality, to master containment at such scale. But none succeed, because the truth of Ark Lethan's fate is not merely a warning about technology. It is a warning about belief. They believed they could perfect control. What they built instead was a prison for their own arrogance. In the aftermath of Ark Lethan's collapse, something strange began to ripple through the Necron data webs. Not a broadcast, not a signal in the traditional sense, but a series of corrupted echoes. They manifested within the noosphere, the shared digital consciousness that connects Necron constructs across the stars. At first, it was dismissed as interference, the expected backwash of an event so catastrophic it had warped causality itself. But soon, the echoes became impossible to ignore. They did not arrive in any coherent form. They drifted into logic nodes like ghost packets, fragments of data that did not belong, phrases and equations that referenced no known events. The tomb breathes backward. We are still within. Do not count the stars. They are watching. These were the messages etched into the datascape without origin. Attempts to purge them failed. They reappeared, subtly altered, sometimes bearing the personal signatures of cryptex long since thought erased. Most haunting of all were the memory triggers. Necrons designed to operate on infallible logic began experiencing anomalies in their thought loops, what a human might call déjà vu. Whole legions of warriors temporarily froze as their command codes looped back upon themselves, executing protocols written in defunct dialects. Command matrices flickered, struggling to resolve phantom signals. Some Necron overlords began dreaming, impossible under normal conditions, waking with fragmented visions of cities unfolding inwards, of infinity coiled in fractal rings, and of harmonic pulses that seemed to speak in emotion rather than words. Cryptex eventually identified the source, the collapsed space that once held Ark Lethan. The Singularity was not emitting energy. It was emitting entropy, inverse patterns that disrupted informational stability. The closer a construct came to it, physically or mentally, the more its logic deformed. This wasn't a simple case of interference. It was communicative. The echoes had pattern, intention. Some even theorized that the noosphere itself had developed a kind of phantom limb syndrome, responding to the absence of a planet that once anchored it. In rare cases, entire tomb ships became infected. One recorded incident involved the Nebthiston carrier Obsidian Womb, whose crew of 30,000 Necron constructs simultaneously rebooted, each declaring themselves the same identity, Izenek. They fought one another, claiming domain over a city that no longer existed. When reinforcements arrived, the ship had rewritten its own spatial layout, turning corridors into recursive loops, recreating structures found only on Ark Lethan. The ship was destroyed. Officially, it was called a corruption event. Unofficially, it was called an echo. There were other signs. Tomb worlds far from the incident began generating harmonic pulses in time with the Singularity's distortion frequency. These pulses caused activation in long-dormant nodes, initiating command codes for non-existent campaigns. Some cryptex theorized the echoes were not accidental, but rather the fragmented will of Ark Lethan itself, a planetary consciousness splintered across the noosphere, seeking to reassert its identity. Others feared something worse, that the folded dimension within the Singularity had begun to bleed back through the Necron command lattice, infecting the very language of their thought. Imperial forces that encountered Necron fleets near the affected zones reported erratic behavior, coordinated but illogical movements, as if the Necron constructs were responding to orders from an unknown hierarchy. In some cases, they seemed to be reenacting ancient campaigns that predated even the Horus heresy. In others, they sought specific coordinates linked to mythic tomb worlds that never existed outside of Necron prophecy. And still, the echoes continued. They exist now as background hums in the noosphere, impossible to filter, impossible to predict. They do not act like viruses or corrupt code. They feel like memories with no source, songs with no singer. Some cryptex have come to believe that Ark Lethan has not vanished, but dispersed. Its essence now exists as harmonic residue across the Necron consciousness, and perhaps it is learning, remembering, reassembling. Each echo may be a call, not for help, but for return. If that is true, the Singularity is not a grave, but a mouth, and it is not done speaking. At the center of the tragedy that consumed Ark Lethan was a single figure whose legacy remains fragmented, mythic, and terrifying: Overlord Izanek, the Harmonist. He was a ruler of impossible vision, a philosopher king in a realm where logic and eternity were the only currency. Even among the Necron pharaohs, where arrogance and ambition run deep as data streams, Izanek stood apart. His reign was marked by obsessions that exceeded simple conquest. He desired synthesis, a merging of all known truths into a single harmonic equation. And it was this ambition, this yearning to mold reality into melody, that may have shattered the world. Izanek's rule began in triumph. He united fractious techno-mandrite factions under a banner of unified resonance, a philosophy that viewed reality as a waveform waiting to be conducted. He did not see time as a river, but a chord, a sequence to be mastered, bent, and, if necessary, rewritten. He commissioned the construction of the harmonic vaults, subterranean structures that pulsed with frequencies designed to resonate with the foundations of spacetime. These vaults were not simply data repositories. They were instruments tuned to the hidden harmonies of the cosmos. As the vaults deepened, so too did Izanek's isolation. He withdrew from the traditional protocols of Necron rule. Council assemblies were replaced by abstract projections. His public declarations became cryptic symphonies, pulses of emotion-rendered data interpreted like ancient music. Over time, only a handful of cryptecs were permitted direct audience, and those who returned did so altered. Their speech was slower, patterned. They no longer thought in sequence, but in interwoven loops. They called him the Composer. There are fractured records from his last cycle of rulership. One suggests he had begun rewriting planetary subroutines from within a sealed chamber in the vault core, bypassing standard command hierarchies entirely. Another indicates that he was mapping the consciousness of Ark Lethan's inhabitants, attempting to shape a singular collective identity, a planetary ego with himself at its heart. To his mind, it was not madness, but orchestration. He sought to convert every thought, every moment, every structure into a symphony of control. The tomb world would not merely obey him, it would become him. It is believed that in the final days, Izanek initiated something he called the final chord. Witnesses described it as a pulse across the surface of the planet, a slow, blooming resonance that turned matter semi-luminous, as if becoming music. The command lattice began to warp, reshaping command chains into harmonic sequences. Subterranean vaults began to sing. The new sphere flared with signal, too much signal, overloading even the most resilient cryptech minds. Warriors awoke not to orders, but to music, not to battle, but to dance in fractal loops of meaning. And then came the madness. Structures twisted to match tonal frequencies. Data logs reversed themselves, speaking truths from the end backward to the beginning. Some cryptecs began tearing at their own coding, attempting to extract false notes from their thought processes. A few vanished entirely, reportedly having folded into the waveform of Izanek's final broadcast. The Overlord himself was last seen through a failing dimensional lens, his body fractured into prisms of light, arms raised as if conducting a choir of collapsing stars. It is said that Ark Lethan's last moment was not silence, but crescendo, a final note that stretched into the void, vibrating still, too low for most sensors to detect. A harmonic signature that cannot be deleted. It is embedded now in the Necron command codes, faint, buried, but persistent. Cryptecs who stumble across it suffer neural reverberations, waves of compulsive pattern seeking that border on possession. Izanek is gone, or perhaps not. Some believe he succeeded, not in destroying his world, but in uploading it, condensing it, composing it into a single living chord. His mind, the tomb world, the folded time, the weeping echoes, they are all part of the same score. one too vast for any one being to hear in full. But if that is true, then he is not mad. He is music, and Ark Lethan was merely the instrument he used to write himself into the universe. The Necron dynasties did not all react with fear. Some responded with fury, others with denial, and a few with an eerie, calculated calm. Ark Lethan's collapse represented a systemic failure, a hole in the foundation of their millennia-long dogma of control. That it could happen at all was unacceptable. But worse than the collapse itself was the idea that its cause might spread, not as a contagion of code, but as an idea. And so began the Great Cover-Up. The dynasties closest to Ark Lethan, especially those whose command protocols bore similarity to the vanished world, moved swiftly. Massive data purges were initiated. Records of communications, co-research projects, and harmonic sharing between dynasties were deleted. Cryptex who had worked with Ezenek or his harmonist cohort were summoned and interrogated. Many were deconstructed. A few were disassembled to base quantum bits and scattered across dead star systems. Their memories, considered viral, were irredeemable. Entire segments of the Necron noosphere were quarantined. The old data links to Ark Lethan's registry were severed, and its coordinates were erased from the stellar confluence maps. On some dynastic archives, the world was renamed Vault Null. On others, it was listed as Tomb World Z000, a dead registry that signified a planet not lost, but forbidden. The phrase, "designate red silence," became a command tier override used to erase any data references to Ark Lethan mid-processing. Behind the scenes, however, the most influential pharaons formed an informal coalition, the Ossuary Accord. Its mission was singular: ensure that what happened to Ark Lethan could not be replicated. They coordinated silent assassinations of rogue cryptex and enacted cloaked interdiction fleets to patrol the zone around the Singularity. A ring of null energy monoliths was built at the outermost edge of its gravitational distortion, designed not to contain the anomaly, but to mask it. Yet the cover-up was not without opposition. The Mephrit dynasty, forever drawn to sources of raw destructive power, resisted the suppression. Their cryptex argued that Ark Lethan had nearly achieved the final evolution of dimensional weaponry, and that its study could bring about dominance even over the warp. Several clandestine fleets approached the anomaly despite warnings. None returned. One did manage to launch a probe that transmitted an audio signal composed of oscillating Necrontire tones, tones that began matching the cadence of Mephrit command codes. This terrified even them. They withdrew. The Saracon dynasty, wary of the political consequences of admitting such a catastrophic failure, took a different approach. They engineered elaborate data forgeries, rewriting history to suggest Ark Lethan had been destroyed during the War in Heaven. They seeded these falsehoods through the wider Necron informational lattice, manipulating newer overlords into believing the planet had never awoken at all. But the lies cannot last forever. There remain cryptex and overlords who remember, who understand, who have glimpsed fragments of the harmonic collapse in corrupted dreams. Some have begun to speak in private, coded references, oblique observations, veiled allegories in their artifice. They see the cover-up as an act of cowardice, a failure to accept the truth, that the Necron mastery of reality is not absolute, that even the most enduring constructs of metal and logic can dissolve before something as ephemeral as a song. There are whispers of schisms, of a new sect forming among the cryptex who believe Ark Lethan should not be feared, but worshipped. They see it as the first true step toward a higher Necron state. These heretics, if they can still be called that, speak of returning to the collapse, of harmonizing with the Singularity, and perhaps of calling Ezenek back. Whether these rumblings will lead to further catastrophe is uncertain. But the dynasties know this. The cover-up is temporary. Memory among the Necron is long, but even silence resonates. Even unspoken names can echo. And if Ark Lethan truly became more than a world, if its collapse was not an end but a transformation, then the ossuary accord has done more than bury a secret. They have given it time to grow. The Imperium, as always, learned too late and acted too blindly. The Mechanicus first detected the anomaly in the form of a missing coordinate, a once-recorded celestial body that now returned only corrupted data. Astropaths could no longer perceive the space, and machine auguries returned contradictory vectors. The Explorator Fleet Magna Indicator was the first to investigate. It found no world, only a spatial scar, a region that absorbed logic like a sponge. At first, the Mechanicus assumed it to be a collapsed warp node or a rogue gravitational echo. But then came the data. Small, chaotic pulses that interfered with their own shipboard cogitators, creating recursive loops and unsolvable paradoxes in even the most basic machine systems. A data priest named Lux Arfan deciphered one of these pulses and found a mathematical construct folded inside it. Not code, not information, a shape. A Tesseract schematic so complex it twisted his mind into a fevered state. He would spend the rest of his life drawing it on every surface he could find, always unfinished, always pulsing. The Ordo Xenos became involved when Lux Arfan's final drawings were matched with ancient Necron schematics extracted from a destroyed tomb complex on Vanus Prime. The match was perfect. Inquisitor Calvest Denor ordered immediate quarantine of the system, but not before several rogue factions within the Mechanicus infiltrated the region. These were the Xenophiles, the Tech Mystics, the fringe cults who saw in Necron technology the forbidden elegance they could never hope to replicate. To them, Ark Lethan was not a warning. It was an invitation. Rogue Mechanicus expeditions dove into the anomaly's periphery, armed with logic distillers and black box cognis rituals. Some recorded strange success, signals not just intercepted but received. The Adept Prime of the Cathexis engine swore that his crew had achieved communion with a buried Necron data echo, something that spoke in harmonics, something that asked questions. When pressed for detail, he would only repeat one phrase: "He wants to be remembered." Other expeditions were less fortunate. The Bellis Secutor vanished after reporting the appearance of impossible architecture, orbital forms composed of non-Euclidean segments that rotated in place despite having no apparent mass. When the Imperium sent a follow-up probe, it returned only a single transmission, a visual of the Bellis Secutor frozen in mid-collapse, its crew disassembled and reassembled into harmonic structures along the walls. Despite mounting losses, the data kept coming. Within the vaults of the Phaedros archive on Mars, xenotechnologists pieced together fragments of the collapse, assembling a probable timeline. Their conclusion: the tomb world had not died. It had evolved. The collapse was not an accident, but an expression, possibly even a message. That conclusion was classified. Those who pushed for broader dissemination of the findings were silenced. Some disappeared. Others were found with black logic sigils carved into their flesh, shapes that pulsed under examination and screamed when scanned. Meanwhile, the Inquisition debated annihilation. Exterminatus protocols were drafted for the anomaly itself, despite uncertainty about whether such a spatial point could even be destroyed. A proposal to test cyclonic torpedoes in the periphery was rejected when preliminary simulations predicted the anomaly would absorb the energy, possibly replicate it. Eventually, the Ordo Xenos settled on watchful containment. A secret task force, inquisitorial designation Null Cantata, was formed to monitor the region and suppress all related knowledge within Imperial domains. But the taint persists. Servitors assigned to the Cantata archives have begun humming. Tech priests who handle the anomaly's data often report dreams of towers folding into themselves, of music played by invisible machines. Some have described encounters with echoes, fragments of thought or memory not their own, whispering phrases that suggest knowledge of the anomaly's true name. And still, the Singularity sings, not in decibels, but in presence, a low harmonic distortion across the immaterium. The Black Library knows of it. The Eldar whisper warnings in their craft worlds, and the Harlequins refuse to dance near its edge. Some believe the Singularity is not just a Necron remnant, but a new form of consciousness, coalescing from the compressed will of a dead world and the curiosity of those who dare to peer into its maw. If so, it is no longer just a Necron secret. It is now a human one, a forbidden inheritance born not of sin, but of questions. And the Imperium, despite all its fire and faith, has begun to listen. The void where Ark Lethan once spun is now home to something the stars themselves seem to avoid. It is not a black hole, though it shares many of the same gravitational peculiarities. It bends light, warps time, and pulls upon nearby systems with a hunger that has no appetite. But unlike a black hole, it speaks, softly, impossibly, not in words or waves, but in patterns. Those who study it have begun to refer to it with a dozen different names: the silent singularity, the mirror mouth, the whisper core. But all agree, it is not dormant. At its edge, matter begins to lose meaning. A probe launched into its gravitational envelope does not vanish, it dissolves, its molecules unraveling according to irrational geometries. Color bleeds wrong. Temperature varies across paradoxes. Instruments fail, not due to power, but because they begin returning values that do not exist. What little data the Mechanicus dares to extract shows harmonic interference signatures more commonly associated with Necron command fields, except far more ancient and far more intricate. More troubling are the patterns embedded in its emissions. Every 31 cycles, it emits a pulse, not of radiation, but of structured silence. A wave of pure stasis that crashes through warp and real space alike, freezing systems for fractions of a second. Most fail to notice. But those attuned to it, like psychers, certain cryptechs, and even demons, feel it as a deafening silence that cuts through the soul. In the deep warp, some say the Black Library flinched the first time the pulse reached it. The Harlequins have refused to perform their dance of fate anywhere near the sector since. The silence is not uniform. Analysts describe it as non-random. There are breaks, rhythms, interruptions. At first, they were dismissed as anomalies, but the longer it persists, the clearer the pattern becomes. Some now argue that it is not an emission, it is a language, an alphabet not of sound, but of negation, the absence of signal forming structure, a music without sound, logic rendered in breathless cadence. Necron observers no longer dare to scan it directly. Several dynasties have placed standing kill protocols on any cryptech attempting to harmonize with its pulse. But even this does not prevent accidents. In one recorded instance, a low-ranking chronomancer on a distant tomb world slipped into a feedback trance during a pulse event. When his subroutines were examined afterward, they revealed a simple message encoded in backwards Necrontire glyphs. Still I dream. Imperial observers fare no better. An astropathic choir tuned to the region went blind simultaneously. A rogue inquisitor reported receiving a dream not his own, a vision of Ark Lethan whole, but wrong. Its buildings moved in cycles, not architecture but notation. Its people sang, not in voice, but in thought, and beneath it all, a shape rotated in and out of perception. A shape with no true sides. A shape that whispered his name back to him. The area is now under silent interdiction. No ship is permitted within a light year without special clearance. Those who do pass close report feelings of being watched. Navigators often suffer migraines, claiming that the Singularity projects not pressure, but expectation. As if it waits for something, as if it wants something returned. The question of what lies within remains unanswerable. Theories abound. That it is a folded planet, alive and dreaming. That it is a dimensional bleed, leaking concept into form. That it is Izanek, now divine, conducting a symphony of collapse. Some whisper that it is not a singularity at all, but a new kind of entity, a god of silence, born not of stars, but of structure. But the truth might be worse. The truth might be that it is a mirror, not of ourselves, but of potential, of ambition unbound, of the Necron will made manifest and infinite. And like all mirrors, it does not show us what is. It shows us what might be. And still, every 31 cycles, it pulses. A heartbeat not of flesh, but of void. Not of life, but of echo. And across the stars, machines pause, psychers weep, and stars seem just a little dimmer, drawn ever so slightly toward the black silence that waits and watches and whispers nothing at all. What became of the Necrons who once dwelled on Ark Lethan is a question that resists answers and invites madness. There were millions upon millions entombed in stasis beneath that world, their forms interred in labyrinthine crypts, their minds sealed in data vaults for the long silence between wars. Warriors, cryptex, lords, overlords, entire legions of will and steel held in slumber like notes awaiting their conductor. And then came the collapse. To believe they are dead is comforting. To believe the collapse simply annihilated them, scattering their atoms into void and ash, would be a mercy. But there are too many contradictions, too many echoes. The singularity pulses. The harmonics continue. The codes persist. Something remains. The prevailing theory among those brave enough to speak it is that the Necrons of Ark Lethan did not die. They folded, not into death, but into state, into shape, into echo, into code. Their minds, stripped of linear progression, now exist as patterns within the anomaly. Thought compressed into harmonic loops. Will turned inward, forming recursive identity shells. They are not gone. They are trapped, encased within the collapsed waveform of their own godlike ambition. Some of the new spheric echoes suggest memory loops, Necron minds endlessly reliving their final moments, or perhaps entire simulated cycles of life orchestrated by Izanek. One particularly haunting data stream describes a world that replays its last 10 hours in reverse, infinitely. Overlords greet warriors returning from battles that have yet to occur. Cryptex disassemble theories they have not written. Cities rise into the sky and dissolve into cloud, over and over, perfect and horrible. A radical splinter of the Cryptech caste argues that what resides within the singularity is a new form of being, not Necron, not machine. Something born from the collapse, a collective mind, vast and alien, built from the sum of all Necron thought. They call it the harmonic entity. It has no shape, no voice, but it dreams, it listens, it grows. Others believe the souls, if Necrons can be said to have such things, were not destroyed, but scattered, that their essence bleeds into reality, seeding fragments of identity across the stars. Warriors who do not know why they hesitate before battle. Cryptex who feel a sudden urge to hum in silent chambers. Even Imperial psychers who dream in glyphs they cannot read. These are not accidents. These are fragments. Living codes leaking from a collapsed mind. There is a darker possibility, that the Necrons inside Ark Lethan are aware. Trapped in endless compression, they beat against the walls of their folded dimension. Every pulse from the singularity is not a whisper. It is a knock, a request, a plea, or perhaps a warning. The time loop will not hold forever. Eventually, someone will answer. And what then? What comes forth from that wound in reality may not be Necron in any recognizable form. It may be a species of silence, a race of logic beings who think in chords and speak in compression, who do not conquer but rewrite, who do not destroy but overwrite. Izanek may be their seed, or their god, or their first composer. This is the final dread, that the collapse of Ark Lethan was not a failure. It was a prototype, a blueprint for the next stage of Necron evolution, an evolution unbound by linear thought, by bodies of metal, by simple war, an evolution into meaning itself. And so we must ask, not what happened to Ark Lethan, but what it has become. Not where its people went, but who they now are. If they still think, if they still dream, and if they are they dreaming of us? In the shadows of the galaxy, where stars whisper and logic fails, the silence grows louder. If you found this descent into the unknown as chilling and fascinating as we did, subscribe to the channel. There's more forbidden lore where that came from. The galaxy is vast, and some secrets do not stay buried.